Class, we're going to look at section 12.2 today. We have two learning targets today. We want to solve equations containing radicals, and we want to solve equations by using radicals. A couple of vocab today: radical function, square root parent function, the square root function. We know the parent function is just the simplest version of whatever function we're looking at. So the square root parent function is just the simplest version of the square root function. Speaking of the square root function, this is what it looks like. All right. So this is the function y is equal to the square root of x. It's the simplest square root function. All right. Now, what I want you to see, and if we were actually in class, we'd probably do some graphing with this, and we'd look to see how it moves around. It's very similar to other functions on how it moves around. But the biggest thing I want you to see for now is the fact that we are only in the first quadrant. And the reason is we can only use positive values of x. We've talked about that before, because since we're taking the square root of x, we can only use positive versions of x because we can't take the square root of a negative number. All right? When we take the square root of a negative number, we get into imaginary numbers, which you'll be dealing with later in your high school career. But for now, just know that this is what the square root function looks like. It's all contained within the first quadrant, unless we start moving it around. But the parent function is in the first quadrant. Now, how to solve some equations that have this radical in it. So if we have the square root of x plus 2 is equal to 3. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to square both sides. That leaves me with the square root of x plus 2 squared is x plus 2. The square root of 3 is 9. Let's go ahead and solve now. Subtract 2 from both sides. We get x equals 7. Alright, so we can square both sides to solve if we need to. We can square both sides to solve if we need to. Another example of how these might look is this. Square root of x plus 6 is equal to x. So this time, you probably see that we have an x on the other side. So, when we square both sides, we're going to end up with an x squared, or a quadratic. Alright, so now we have a quadratic equation. Now when we want to solve a quadratic equation, we like to get everything on the same side, have it equal 0. So let's go ahead and get both of those terms to the right side of the equation. Subtract x from both sides, subtract 6 from both sides. This leaves me with x squared minus x minus 6 equals 0. And now you can solve this quadratic equation however you want. You can solve it by factoring, completing the square, quadratic formula, whichever one's your favorite. I'm going to go ahead and solve by factoring. So factors of negative 6 that add to negative 1 would be negative 3 and positive 2. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. We get x equals 3. And we get x equals negative 2. Just like that. So again, we square both sides of the equation and go from there. Next, a little bit different looking here. Let's say we have x squared is equal to 150. Well, we've actually solved equations that look like this before. We would just go ahead and take the square root of both sides, and then you'd write, all right, x is equal to positive or negative, the square root of 150. You would give me some decimal, whatever the square root of 150 is, but we don't want to just give that decimal anymore. Now I want to rewrite this in simplest radical form. So let's do that. So the square root of 150. We need the biggest perfect square that divides 150. Well, the biggest perfect square that divides 150 would be 25. So we can rewrite the square root of 150 as the square root of 25 times the square root of 6. Because 25 times 6 is 150. And then I know the square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 6 is just the square root of 6. So my final answer is the square root, x is equal to positive or negative 5 root 6. For b, x squared is equal to 4 squared plus 3 squared. Here's what I'm thinking. Let's make this simple. 4 squared is 16, 3 squared is 9. We get x squared is equal to 25. Take the square root of both sides. X is equal to positive or negative 5. Just to make that one a little more simple. And last C. X squared is equal to y squared plus z squared. So, we're going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Now, here's the thing. Unfortunately, we cannot simply break this up into the square root of y plus the square root of z. It only works for multiplication that we can break it up like this. Only multiplication. We cannot break up an addition, okay? So writing this would be incorrect. All right? So we just leave this as positive or negative. Square root of y squared plus z squared. That's as far as we can go with that. All right. That's about all I want to cover for 12-2. Do your homework.